Chapter 5. "Come on, Liz," Jessica said, her face wrinkling with irritation. "Hans is going to be here tonight, and I told him I'd meet him ages ago." The twins were in the parking lot of the Dairy Burger, a hamburger spot that was a favorite meeting place for Sweet Valley High students. It had all the right ingredients to make it fun on a weekend night. A good jukebox, wonderful burgers and shakes, and large booths. That night, a kind of informal gathering from school was taking place inside the crowded restaurant. Elizabeth recognized dozens of familiar faces as she went through the door with her sister. "Liz, Jess, over here," Ken Matthews called, waving from 3 small tables that had been pushed together in the back. Elizabeth followed Jessica, though following Jessica meant stopping every 2 feet to say hello to someone. As usual, Jessica was managing to get mileage out of her escapade at the mall that day. She told everybody about it, embroidering the details so that it sounded even sillier than it actually had been. "Phew," Elizabeth laughed when they had finally made it to the back of the restaurant. People moved their chairs so that Jessica and Elizabeth could squeeze in. 10 was a few too many for a comfortable fit, but comfort wasn't the most important thing. A holiday atmosphere was prevailing, and what mattered was being together. Ken was sitting with Aaron Dallas and Aaron's new girlfriend, Patsy Weber, who was squished between them, dwarfed by their big shoulders. Olivia Davidson and her boyfriend Roger Patman were sitting next to each other. The twins had squeezed in next to Winston Egbert and Enid Rowlands, who was there with a date, an outgoing, brown-eyed freshman from Sweet Valley College named Chip Edelson. Jessica was scanning the restaurant eagerly for Hans, who was either late or hidden in a far booth. "Hey, Jess, has your Secret Santa been good to you?" Winston asked suddenly, winking at Ken. "He sure has," Jessica said smugly. "He's obviously a man of incredible taste. Not like some people," her look clearly said. Winston flushed. He had once had a crush on Jessica and still seemed to be strongly affected by her. "I got a 5-pound bag of red pistachio nuts today," Patsy said, giggling. "Aaron is going to get jealous if my Secret Santa's this attentive all week." "I got a coupon for a free back rub from mine," Aaron grinned. "I can't wait to find out who it is." "Speaking of surprises," Jessica said, catching her twin's eye, "I'm afraid Liz and I have a real bombshell to drop. You tell them, Liz." "No," Elizabeth sighed. "I can't stand to be the bearer of bad news. You tell them, Jess." "Somebody tell us," Patsy Weber wailed. "I'm dying of suspense." Okay, Jessica said, looking serious. "But remember, we warned you. It isn't good." "Jessica," Ken said threateningly. "All right," Jessica yelped. "Guess who's coming to town?" she asked. "Beats me," Winston said. "Santa Claus?" Patsy Weber piped up. "Suzanne Devlin," Jessica told them, "tomorrow, and she's staying for 2 whole weeks." "Ah!" Winston exclaimed, burying his head in his hands. "We're ruined." "The plague," Ken Matthews said. "We're being visited by the plague." Aaron groaned. "I can't stand it. I knew everything was too good around here. How can you guys possibly let that monster come back?" "We can't help it," Elizabeth said. "She's told my parents she wants to visit. Supposedly she wants to apologize in person to make up with everyone." "Fat chance," Winston muttered. "She's probably just sick of making everyone on the East Coast miserable and thought she'd spread the wealth." "I feel horrible about it," Elizabeth told them. "It's bad enough that we have to suffer, but to inflict her on you guys again—" "Who," Chip asked innocently, "is Suzanne Devlin?" The whole group was quiet for a second, and then everyone burst out laughing. "I'll explain the whole thing to you later," Enid told them. "Otherwise, it'll spoil our appetites." "Suzanne Devlin," Winston informed him, "is without a doubt the craftiest, most manipulative, most—" "Gorgeous," Olivia supplied for him. "Most gorgeous," Winston repeated, shaking his head. "Most impossible girl on the whole earth. She's bad news with a capital B. She's a pain in the neck with a capital P. She's—" Chip laughed. "I get the idea. Why is she coming back if she's so popular around here? That's a good question, Elizabeth said. To be honest, we're not sure, but we figure we'd rather spend our time making sure she won't come back, Jessica finished. 2 weeks, Winston groaned. Ugh, I don't think the town will last that long under siege. Isn't there some way to stop her? Elizabeth sighed. No, I'm afraid we're just going to have to put up with her. Well, Aaron said, putting his arm around Patsy and giving her a hug, let us know if you need help giving her a rough time. We're ready, aren't we, Winston? Elizabeth looked horrified. It was one thing for her and Jessica to plan pranks, but to involve anybody else. We owe it to her to at least be civil, she told Aaron. I mean, we can't. Thanks, Aaron, Jessica interrupted. We always knew we could count on you if things got really awful. Jessica, Elizabeth gasped, but it was too late. Jessica had just caught sight of Hans, who was coming in the door with Bruce Patman, and she was off like a flash, her most flirtatious smile on her face. My sister, Elizabeth thought, is absolutely impossible. Don't worry, Liz, Enid said warmly, sensing, as she always could, when her friend was upset. I'm sure things with Suzanne won't be as bad as they were last time. How could they be? Winston pointed out. Nothing could possibly be as bad as last time. I hope not, Elizabeth said, watching Jessica out of the corner of her eye. She wished Winston were right, but with Jessica on the rampage, Elizabeth couldn't be sure. And there was nothing that Elizabeth or anyone else could do. Elizabeth was engrossed in a conversation with Patsy when she realized that the whole restaurant had suddenly fallen quiet. She wondered what had caused everyone to stop talking. Turning around, she followed the eyes of her schoolmates, who were looking at the Dairy Burger entrance. It was the Sweet Valley High swim team led by Bill Chase, an attractive blonde junior whose surfing expertise had won him a fan club at school. But that wasn't what was making everyone stare in silence. The guys were wearing only bathing suits. Each had a towel around his neck, and they were walking together in a line, each with his hand on the shoulder of the guy in front of him. It was the most hilarious performance Elizabeth had ever seen, and they were heading right for her table. Olivia Davidson, Stan Richards called out, stepping forward with a mock bow. Your secret Santa has instructed us to serenade you. Olivia turned beet red. Oh my God, she gasped, clapping her hands to her face. Oh no, tell me this isn't happening. But it was happening. Stan blew a note on a pitch pipe. Bill Chase chimed in with him, and the next moment all 10 guys were singing Silent Night while the crowd that had gathered screamed encouragement. Elizabeth had never seen anyone turn as red as Olivia. Stop them, she begged, hiding her face against Roger's shoulder. Roger, make them stop. But it was obvious the swimmers' choir was having far too good a time to stop. For the next 10 minutes, they entertained the restaurant with no fewer than 5 Christmas carols, some more off-key than others, but all more or less recognizable. After her initial embarrassment, even Olivia enjoyed the show. By the time the swimmers were done serenading her, she was begging them to stay as loudly as all her classmates. Amazing, Enid said, shaking her head as the swim team walked away. Whoever would have thought the swim team had that much musical talent? Elizabeth just shook her head. She was wondering what Mr. Collins would say if he realized how exotic the Secret Santa gifts were becoming. Hey, Liz, Ken joked, waving his straw at her like a baton. I'll bet you can't wait till Todd gets back. Elizabeth blushed as everyone turned to stare at her. That's right, Winston said, whistling. The star-crossed lovers will be reunited any day now. Let's see if our on-the-spot interview for Channel 5 can reveal the hidden emotions Ms. Wakefield is experiencing right now. Adopting a television reporter's voice, Winston grabbed the straw out of Ken's hand to represent a microphone. Tell us, Ms. Wakefield, will you be glad to see Mr. Wilkins when he gets into town on Monday? Cut it out, Winston, Elizabeth laughed and pushed the straw away as he thrust it toward her. She didn't feel like joking about Todd's imminent visit. In fact, she didn't feel like talking about it at all. What's the matter? Enid asked her later when the 2 girls were alone out in the parking lot. Enid was waiting for Chip to make a phone call, and Elizabeth was waiting for Jessica to finish flirting. For the night, anyway, with Hans. Nothing, Elizabeth smiled. I just feel I don't know, kind of quiet right now. You know what I mean? I do, she said quietly. It's Todd, isn't it? She asked. Elizabeth nodded. I guess I'm a little nervous, she admitted. I've been looking forward to seeing him again for so long, but now that it's really almost here, everything's going to be fine, Enid told her. Don't worry about a thing, kiddo. You know you two will see fireworks the minute you hold each other in your arms. Elizabeth sighed. Maybe you're right, she said. The truth is, I'm just afraid that I might be expecting too much, you know? Enid shook her head. You and Todd are like bread and butter, she told her confidently. You belong together. Now quit worrying. The minute Todd gets her, everything will be all right. I just know it. How's Chip? Elizabeth asked curiously, dropping her voice a little. He's really adorable. Isn't he? Enid smiled. He's sweet. Maybe a little too sweet, but so far so good. This is only our second date, and I never feel like I can tell what's going on till I've spent some time with a guy. I know what you mean, Elizabeth agreed. Oh, look, Chip's done with his phone call, Enid said, catching sight of her date coming out of the dairy burger. I'd better run. Where's Jess? God knows, Elizabeth said, getting annoyed. If she doesn't come out soon, I'll have to go in and get her. Chip and Enid kept her company, and a minute later, Jessica strolled out, a radiant smile on her face. Sorry, she said lightly, grabbing the keys out of Elizabeth's hand and slipping into the driver's seat of the Fiat. Elizabeth made a face at Enid and Chip. Sisters, she said, hurrying around to the passenger side. Thanks for waiting with me, you two. Liz, I'm in love, Jessica declared when Elizabeth got into the car. Hans? Elizabeth asked. He's so wonderful, Liz, Jessica sighed. Those foreigners really know how to kiss. She started the car up. What do you think, Liz? Can you see me living in a castle somewhere in Bavaria? Sounds like a horror movie, Elizabeth laughed. You and Baron von Frankenstein deep in the Bavarian woods. When are you two planning to move to Germany together? I don't know, Jessica admitted. She looked nonplussed. I forgot to ask him. A shudder ran through her as she backed the Fiat out of the parking lot. I certainly wouldn't want to let him go back without me if we really do fall in love. No offense, Liz, but I don't see how you and Todd can stand this long-distance stuff. What do you mean? Jessica shrugged. I don't know. It's just always seemed to me that being tied down is only worth it if you really get to see each other. With him in Vermont and you here... But Todd and I aren't really tied down, Elizabeth protested. We're both free to date. You know that, Jess. Jessica wrinkled her nose. Date? When was the last time you really went out on a date? Sure, you get someone to go with you if there's a big dance or something, but Todd's the only guy you care about. Admit it. Elizabeth sighed. Can I help it if I'm slow, Jess? I just can't imagine caring for more than one guy at a time. Jessica digested that thought for a minute as she drove. True, she said after a while. I suppose I never care for more than one guy at a time either. It's just that mine seem to have a quicker turnover rate. She giggled. You and Todd, you two seem practically married. Only he's in Vermont and you're here. What a mess. Elizabeth laughed. She was used to hearing her love life analyzed by her twin. Still, it had been a long time since she had been on her own, really on her own, without Todd to think about. She wondered now how it would feel to get excited about seeing some guy in the hall, to spend hours getting ready to go out. Of course, Jessica was saying, the thing about long-distance love is that it's very romantic. You must be so excited about seeing Todd on Monday. Are you going to meet him at the airport? No, Elizabeth said. Ken and his father are going to pick him up, and I thought I'd stay home so I could see him alone. What time will he be here? Elizabeth shook her head. He's calling tomorrow night to let me know the exact time. I wonder, Jessica said thoughtfully, what people think about Todd at his new school. Do you suppose he's really popular? Elizabeth laughed. Do you mean with girls? I'm sure he is, she said lightly. She couldn't imagine him without a group of close friends, both girls and boys. She knew he thrived on company and would be miserable without an active social life. But what about girls as more than friends? Tell me the truth, Liz, Jessica said as she turned into the Wakefield's driveway. She sounded unusually serious. I've always been afraid to ask, but I really want to know how you feel. What would you do if Todd fell in love with someone in Vermont? Elizabeth didn't know what to say. It was a question she had asked herself before but never answered, and she was speechless now. I thought so, Jessica said, staring at her. You'd be miserable, she concluded, turning off the engine. I just had to ask. Why, why couldn't I answer? Elizabeth wondered, following Jessica into the house. Would I really feel so strongly if Todd told me he'd fallen in love with some other girl? Elizabeth didn't know. All she hoped was that she and Todd could relax together, that they could try to pick things up from where they left off. Anything further than that, Elizabeth reasoned, was simply too much to ask at this point. Chapter 6. Announcing the arrival of Flight 617 from New York's Kennedy Airport, a voice over the loudspeaker said smoothly. Alice Wakefield sighed as she waited for Suzanne. She couldn't help wishing one of the twins had come along, though she hadn't asked either of them, and she wasn't surprised that they hadn't volunteered. This was a task she would gladly have shared with somebody. What on earth am I going to say to the girl, she wondered. She couldn't help remembering how tense things had been the previous spring, when she and Ned had driven Suzanne back to the airport after her disastrous visit. Mrs. Wakefield had found it hard to believe a girl of 16 could have behaved that way. She, too, had been fooled by Suzanne, and she had been sorely disappointed in what had proven to be the girl's true character. Still, under the circumstances, she reminded herself, shaking her head as she remembered the story Tom Devlin had unfolded the other night on the phone. Poor Suzanne, she thought now. I hope she's prepared for what I'm sure is lying in store for her these next 2 weeks. I wonder if she has any idea. Mrs. Wakefield's reverie was interrupted by the surge of passengers walking toward her. Mrs. Wakefield, Suzanne called, waving from behind a group of people. Mrs. Wakefield knew that Suzanne would look different. She's lost some weight, Tom Devlin had said, and her color's bad from the medication. Sure enough, Suzanne looked much thinner. She was still outstandingly beautiful, her long black hair slightly less lustrous, perhaps, but attractively arranged in a long French braid. Her skin was so pale it looked translucent, and Mrs. Wakefield could detect the faint outline of veins in her forehead. She looked fragile, Mrs. Wakefield thought. Fragile, but lovely. Thank you for coming all the way out here to get me, Suzanne said, putting down the oversized bag she was carrying to embrace Mrs. Wakefield. Let's go down and get your luggage, Mrs. Wakefield smiled, trying to sound natural. Suzanne laughed. This is all I brought, she admitted, waving at her bag. I thought I'd travel light this time. Okay then, Mrs. Wakefield said. Let's go get the car. Surprisingly, the ride from the airport was extremely enjoyable. Mrs. Wakefield couldn't get over the change in Suzanne. She was much quieter than she had been before, and a good deal of her vivacious energy seemed to have been drained from her. But she was wonderful to talk to, pleasant, polite, and astonishingly relaxed. It was as if she'd come to terms with something since the last time she'd been out there and wasn't trying any more to put on a performance. She was simply being herself, and she seemed at peace. I'd better warn you, Mrs. Wakefield said quietly as she turned off the expressway. This isn't going to be easy, Suzanne. I admire you for having the courage to come out here, and I think I understand why you want to go through with it. Mr. Collins told us about the letter you sent him, and I know he's forgiven you, but I have a feeling things are going to be rough for you. Are you sure you're up to it? Suzanne stared out the window, and when she looked back at Mrs. Wakefield, her eyes were filled with tears. I hope so, she said quietly. I have no way of knowing before I try. Well, Mrs. Wakefield said, sighing, Ned and I will do what we can, but I'm afraid— No, Mrs. Wakefield, Suzanne interrupted. I've got to do this on my own. You two have done more than enough just by letting me come out here. The rest is up to me. Well, Mrs. Wakefield thought, I wish I felt better about what's about to happen. But I know Liz was terribly hurt by Suzanne before, and so were most of the kids she knows, and I have a feeling that they're not going to be easy on Suzanne. If only she hadn't sworn us to secrecy, Alice Wakefield thought. If the kids knew, if they had any idea. But Suzanne had made herself perfectly clear. No one was to be told a single thing. She wanted to fight this battle herself. She didn't want pity. She wanted to win everyone over on her own terms, to make up with them all without anyone's help. She wished Suzanne luck, Alice Wakefield thought sadly, but it wasn't going to be easy. In fact, knowing what she knew about her own children, she had a feeling this was going to be one battle Suzanne wouldn't be able to win. "They're here," Jessica hissed, racing from her spot at the window. "They're here!" Mr. Wakefield was out running errands, and Elizabeth, Jessica, and Stephen were alone in the house, waiting for Suzanne and Mrs. Wakefield to get back from the airport. "Now remember," Jessica warned, "no pity. If she acts nice, she's just trying to trick all of us. So don't back down and be nice, no matter what." "We're home," Mrs. Wakefield called a minute later from the living room. Jessica put her finger to her lips. "Remember," she hissed, "act like we forgot she was coming, okay?" "Jessica, Elizabeth," Mrs. Wakefield called, sounding confused. "I don't know where they are," she said to Suzanne, her voice slightly irritated. "I told them we'd be here about now, and they said, 'Jessica, Stephen, where are you guys?'" "I'll go down first," Jessica whispered. "What is it, Mom?" she called down the steps, her voice casual. "What do you mean, what is it?" Mrs. Wakefield called back. "Suzanne's here, and I'd like you to all come downstairs and say hello to her. That's what it is." "Suzanne?" Jessica said vaguely, taking her time coming downstairs. "Oh, Suzanne," she said, coming into the living room. "God, I completely forgot. I'm so embarrassed." "Suzanne, this is Jessica," Mrs. Wakefield said, giving her daughter a murderous look. "I'm sorry, I don't know where Steve is or Liz. Jessica?" "You must be exhausted," Jessica said sweetly, extending her hand as if to shake hands with Suzanne. "How long does it take to fly here from Miami?" "Miami?" Suzanne said, staring at Jessica. "You mean New York?" "Jessica," Mrs. Wakefield said warningly. Jessica clapped her hand to her forehead. "What was I thinking of?" she asked an invisible audience. "Of course! You're from New York. I stayed in your parents' apartment." "That's right," Suzanne said, looking at her a little strangely. "And you met some of my friends, I think, "Your friends," Jessica said, flinging herself down on the sofa and reaching for a piece of candy from the bowl on the coffee table, "were the most fascinating, the most wonderful—" "Suzanne," Elizabeth said breathlessly, running into the room. "I'm so sorry. I was on the phone and I couldn't—" "Liz!" Suzanne exclaimed, hurrying over and embracing Elizabeth. "I'm so glad to see you again." Mrs. Wakefield shook her head. "Suzanne, I'm going to take your bag upstairs," she said flatly. "We're going to put you in Jessica's room again, if that's okay." "It's fine with me," Suzanne said, "if it's okay with Jessica. I am honored," Jessica insisted, as her mother left the room. "Absolutely honored." "You're all so nice," Suzanne began again, somewhat lamely, "to let me come out here and impose myself on you when it's your vacation and everything. I know I'm—" "Nonsense!" Jessica exclaimed with false heartiness. "We've been looking forward to it for days, Susie. Isn't that what people call you, Susie?" Suzanne took a deep breath. "Yes, they do," she began. "Oh, hello, Suzanne," Stephen remarked casually, coming into the room and standing at one end of the couch, looking at Suzanne without smiling. "Well," Suzanne said at last, when it became apparent that was all he was going to say, "it's nice to see you again." Stephen stared at her, raising his eyebrows slightly, and remained silent. "This is unbearable," Elizabeth thought. "How can the poor girl stand it?" "How was your flight?" she said finally, unable to bear the tense silence a moment longer. "Okay," Suzanne said, looking relieved and smiling at Elizabeth. "You know, sort of boring." "Of course," Jessica said significantly. "It's different for us out here, Susie. We're used to being bored, aren't we, Liz? In fact, just the other day I was saying to Steve, we'll have to take a nice airplane ride somewhere soon to interrupt this boring spell we're having." That's right, Stephen cut in. It must be different for you, Suzanne, living right in the middle of New York City. Suzanne blushed. Well, it's kind of divine, Jessica interrupted. What a frantic pace you all keep up in the big city. Good heavens, she exclaimed. I was positively worn out by the exertion. Your friend Pete— He isn't my friend any more, Suzanne said flatly. Jessica, I'm sorry about what happened. You must have been really upset. Upset? Jessica's eyebrows shot up. Well, it's true I'm not used to that sort of thing, she said sweetly. Out here in small-town America, that sort of thing just doesn't happen every day. But all the same— Maybe I'd better go upstairs and wash up, Suzanne said suddenly. Will you excuse me? I'll be down in a few minutes. We'll be right here, Jessica sang out, flashing Suzanne her most sickeningly sweet smile. Jess, Elizabeth said, as soon as Suzanne was out of earshot, maybe you'd better lay off a little bit. Don't you think you're coming on a little too strong? Jessica laughed. Maybe, she admitted. I'll take it easy for a while, but I just can't resist getting off to a brilliant start. I feel sorry for her, Elizabeth said after a minute. I don't know. I think maybe we're doing the wrong thing. Sucker, Jessica hissed. Remember what happened last time, Elizabeth Wakefield? Are you going to let this girl walk all over you just because she's a good actress? Well, trust me, Jessica sang out. Just trust me, Liz. She can take it. I guarantee it. Elizabeth sighed. I guess you're right, she said slowly. But no buts, Jessica declared. Come on, Liz, you've got to have a little backbone. All right, Elizabeth said. I just wish it didn't make me feel so rotten, she thought. But Jessica was right. She couldn't let herself be a sucker again, and Suzanne Devlin certainly knew how to take care of herself. Well, how do you think the terrible trio's doing so far? Jessica asked. It was after dinner, and Stephen, Elizabeth, and Jessica were stretched out in front of the TV set in the living room, watching a movie. The Wakefields were working in the den, and Suzanne had gone to bed right after dinner, claiming she was tired from the flight. Everything seems to be going just the way we planned, Stephen said. I think she's getting the idea. It's funny, Jessica said, rolling over on her stomach, but I don't think she's all that gorgeous, Liz. I mean, she's pretty and everything, but she's way too pale, and I think she'd look better if she weren't quite so thin. Do you think she's anorexic? No, Elizabeth said, but she's definitely lost weight since she was here before. I asked her about it, in fact, and she looked embarrassed. She said she's been on some kind of new diet, but she doesn't want to lose any more. Well, that explains it, I guess, Jessica said thoughtfully. What do you think, Steve? Stephen was quiet for a minute. It's kind of hard to believe that she's still the monster she turned out to be last spring, he admitted. To be honest, I was having a hard time not being nice to her. She seemed really great, very sweet, very interested in all of us. That's what makes it so hard, Elizabeth said sympathetically. I feel the same way myself. Maybe she has changed. Ha, Jessica snorted. You thought she was great before she stole your necklace, before she tried to seduce Mr. Collins and then claim he attacked her. You've got to remember, this is no ordinary operator. Of course she seems nice and charming, but that's what everyone thought last time, too. And look what happened. Jess is right, Elizabeth sighed. It kills me to look at Susie now and think it's all an act. But she's just the way she was when she was here before. Sweet, charming, willing to help. And last time it was all a big fake. So why should it be the real thing this time? That doesn't explain why she came back, Stephen pointed out. The first time, maybe her parents roped her into doing an exchange and she didn't want to come. Maybe she took some things out on people here. But this time she begged to come here. She gave up a trip to St. Moritz to come to Sweet Valley. Why would she get her kicks out of torturing people here? She could be rotten to the Swiss if that's all she's after. Maybe she really does want to apologize, to make up for her behavior. Elizabeth shook her head. It is confusing, she admitted. We don't know for sure why she's here. Maybe her parents forced her again, Jessica pointed out. Maybe they didn't want her with them. The food's really fattening in Europe, Jessica added. If she really is neurotic about her weight, she may have come here so she could keep dieting. Maybe we should sneak butter into her food to make her gain weight. That would really torture her. How'd she get into her bed? Elizabeth demanded. I thought you short-sheeted the bed. I I did, Jessica said. I spied on her, and she was remaking the whole thing. She looked completely baffled. You're terrible, you two, Stephen said suddenly, looking upset. I don't think I want to gang up on the poor girl anymore. I've had enough. Enough? Jessica shrieked. We've barely done anything yet. Still, Stephen said, I think we should leave her alone and give her a chance. Jessica sighed. Softies, she declared. A whole family of softies. Okay, you guys, just wait till she turns into devilish Devlin again. Don't come running to me for help. Elizabeth bit her lip. Was Jessica right? Or had Suzanne really changed? It was so hard to tell, but Elizabeth couldn't help siding with her brother. They'd been terribly unfair to Suzanne, and Elizabeth, for one, was prepared to be a little nicer to her the following morning. But Elizabeth was only half listening to the argument between Jessica and Steve. The next day, Todd would be there, and he was supposed to call any minute and tell her what time he'd be coming over. When the phone rang, Elizabeth immediately jumped up. I'll get it, she said, practically running over Stephen as she raced out of the living room to pick up the extension in the kitchen. It was Todd, as she'd known it would be. All at once, Elizabeth realized that Todd didn't know Suzanne was in Sweet Valley. You're not going to believe it, she said into the phone when he asked her how everything was. Guess who turned up at our house today? When Todd couldn't guess, Elizabeth told him, and from the shocked response on the other end, she guessed he was even more surprised than she'd expected. Chapter 7. Wait a minute, Todd said, clearing his throat. You better back up, Liz. What in the world is Suzanne Devlin doing back in Sweet Valley? We don't know, really, Elizabeth admitted. I mean, we know what she's doing here. She's come to visit us for the next 2 weeks, but we really aren't sure what her motivation is for coming back. Todd said. Elizabeth thought he sounded a little strange. You're upset, aren't you? She asked. I know it's kind of a pain, but so far I haven't seen anything that makes me think she'll really be in the way. She's acting awfully quiet, almost withdrawn. I'm not upset, Todd said. I guess I'm just a little surprised. Somehow I had the impression that Suzanne wouldn't exactly be welcome at your house again after what happened last time. Elizabeth sighed. Todd had been through the whole thing too. As a matter of fact, he had been disgusted by what Suzanne had done. He said later that Suzanne was the sort of girl he couldn't stand. Selfish, spoiled, completely sure she could hurt whomever she wanted and get away with it. I know. It's a long story. I'll tell you when you get here. Elizabeth lowered her voice. I've got an early flight, Todd told her. It looks like I should be in Sweet Valley around 10 or 10:30 since it's 3 hours earlier out there, and I'll come by the minute I've dropped my stuff off at Ken's. Todd, Elizabeth said slowly, are you sure you don't mind that I'm not coming out to the airport? Because if you want me to, I'll... No, I like what you said before, Todd said, about getting to be alone together right away this way. It would be too awful having to say hello to you in front of the Matthewses after so long. Good, Elizabeth said softly. Todd? What is it? Todd asked huskily. I just wanted to ask you. Elizabeth could hear the crackle of long distance between them on the line. Oh, never mind, she said quickly. I love you, Todd. I love you too, Todd whispered, and I can't wait to see you tomorrow, Liz. I'm going to hug you so hard. Have a safe flight, Elizabeth said at last, hating to hang up, even with their reunion so close. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Good night, Todd said softly, waiting for her echoing good night before he laid the receiver back on the phone. Suzanne Devlin, Todd said aloud, shifting his weight on the stool next to the phone in his parents' brand-new kitchen. He could see the snow falling softly through the greenhouse window in the breakfast room. It still startled Todd to see so much whiteness. It was like magic, he thought, looking at the filmy glow through the flakes. Winter magic. He sighed and turned away from the window. He ran through the conversation he had just had with Elizabeth, wondering why he hadn't told Elizabeth the truth the minute she'd mentioned Suzanne's name. Todd had seen Suzanne Devlin recently, in fact, less than a month ago. Todd had become a good skier since he'd moved out to Vermont with his family. Not an expert, but good enough to enjoy a day on the big slopes without getting tired or aching the next day. The weather in Vermont was ideal for skiing. Already that year they'd had a record amount of snow, and he'd been out on the slopes most weekends since October. A guy at school named Jerry Peterson was his favorite skiing companion. Jerry was a tall, well-built boy who was a forward on the basketball team at Lawrence High, Todd's new school in Burlington. Todd met him at basketball practice, and since then they'd become good friends. Jerry was relaxed and had a terrific sense of humor. He loved to ski. Before long, Jerry knew all about Todd's life at Sweet Valley High. He'd seen Todd's collection of snapshots, with Elizabeth in almost every one of them, and he knew all about her and how much she meant to him. 3 or 4 weeks earlier, Jerry had convinced Todd to sign up for a school trip to Killington. Until then, Todd had been skiing on smaller, less popular slopes. He'd heard of Killington and thought the trip sounded fun. "Who knows," Jerry had joked, rubbing his hands together. "Maybe this will be my lucky weekend, and I'll meet some gorgeous ski bunny in the Sugarloaf Lounge." Jerry didn't have a girlfriend, but Todd couldn't say that he wasn't looking. Wherever he and Todd went, he had his eye out for gorgeous girls. He always found a few, and he flirted quite a bit, but nothing much had come of it so far. "But this time," Jerry had joked, "it'll be different." And it was in Killington, at the very lounge Jerry had been joking about, that the two of them ran into Suzanne Devlin. It was about 5:30 in the evening, and Todd had just ordered hot chocolate at the bar. "Now, that's my idea of someone worth waiting around for," Jerry said in a low voice. Todd followed his gaze, not certain at first who Jerry meant because the lounge was crowded. Finally, he picked out a girl standing by the fire. She was wearing white flannel pants and a white sweater, but her back was turned and Todd couldn't see her face. "How can you tell?" he had asked. "You can't see her when her back is to you." "Believe me," Jerry said, "I can tell. Come on, follow me." Todd was halfway across the room, trailing Jerry, when Suzanne turned around. He was so surprised he almost spilled his hot chocolate all over himself. "Wait a minute, Jerry," he exclaimed, trying to stop his friend. "I know that girl." But it was too late. Jerry had already introduced himself, and Todd couldn't see any way out of joining them and saying hello. "Jerry's right," he thought to himself, as he set down his cup of hot chocolate. "Suzanne is still a knockout." "We've already met," Todd said brusquely when Jerry started to introduce them. Suzanne, to Todd's surprise, looked glad to see him. She didn't look embarrassed, but when she took his hand, she smiled and added, "Under kind of crummy circumstances, I'm afraid. I'm glad I've gotten a chance to see you again." It turned out that Suzanne was staying with her parents in a condominium in Killington for the weekend. "We come up fairly often from the city," she told Todd and Jerry. "Daddy's a marvelous skier, but I'm afraid my mother and I are pretty much useless." "You haven't been out today?" Jerry asked, looking disappointed. "No," Suzanne admitted. "I don't think I'd have the stamina. It's so cold outside." Todd gave Suzanne a second glance. It was funny, he thought, but he didn't remember her looking so frail when she was staying with Elizabeth. Had she lost weight, he wondered, or was he just imagining things? "Why don't you join us for dinner?" Jerry said suddenly, looking hard at Suzanne. "I'm sure you and Todd have a lot to catch up on. We were just going to get a burger or something in town." "Well," Suzanne looked uncertain, "I can't stay out very late. I want to get a good night's sleep. Can we be in by 9 or 9:30? 9 or 9:30, Todd thought. Was this the sophisticated big city girl he had met in Sweet Valley? Todd was certain his evening, and his weekend, would be ruined. But it was obvious that Jerry was crazy about Suzanne, and there was no time for Todd to warn him about what she was really like. Half an hour later, the three of them were sitting in a dark, cozy booth in a bustling hamburger restaurant, McMahon's. Suzanne would never put up with this place, Todd thought. It had to be way beneath the diplomat's daughter to eat in a place with a jukebox and sawdust on the floor. But Suzanne looked delighted. After some confusion about who would sit where, she ended up sliding into the booth next to Todd. She smelled good, he found himself noticing. Not like the perfume she used to wear. No, now she smelled like soap and pine needles and fresh air. 2 hours later, the three of them were still in the booth, laughing and talking. When the check arrived, Suzanne tried to snatch it out of Jerry's hand and bumped against Todd in the struggle. Her leg brushed his, and Todd's face turned bright red. "Sorry," Suzanne said lightly, starting to laugh again. "Thank you both," she said when they dropped her back off at the lodge, "for a wonderful time. I mean it." Jerry looked gloomy, and Todd could tell that his attempt to line up a date for the next afternoon had failed. "See you," he said, getting into his car again. "Todd," Suzanne said suddenly, "I have to talk to you. Is there any way you could meet me back here tomorrow afternoon? Maybe we could take a walk or something." "Oh, well," Todd thought fast. He didn't want to leave Jerry on his own. "Please," Suzanne begged. "Todd, I really need to talk." "How about 2:30, Todd suggested. That way, he thought, Jerry could get in some skiing before they drove back the following evening. "Great," Suzanne said, her eyes shining. "Way to go," Jerry muttered when Todd got back in the car. "What's your secret, Wilkins?" "Come on, Jer," he said lightly. "She's a friend of Liz's. I met her in Sweet Valley ages ago." "Who cares how you met her?" Jerry laughed, his bad mood lifting. "Look, pal, with a girl like that, it doesn't matter how. Just be thankful you did." Todd laughed uncertainly. "I wonder what's up with Suzanne," he thought. "She sure seemed different tonight." The next day, Todd met Suzanne at the lodge, and they took a walk together as they'd planned. Suzanne looked even prettier than she had the night before. She was wearing a snow-white ski jacket with blue trim, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. The two walked in silence for a while before Suzanne began to speak. She told him that her behavior at the Wakefield's house had been absolutely awful, and that it made her sick to think about it now. "I was so angry with my parents," she recollected, her eyes misting over a little, "that I took it out on all of you. Anyway," she concluded, "I was overjoyed to see you last night in the lodge. I'd always hoped that we'd run into each other again, and I want you, if you can, to accept my apology." For the next hour, Todd and Suzanne continued walking up a narrow trail, talking as easily and as naturally as though they'd been friends for years. Todd found himself noticing a number of things about her he'd previously missed. The dazzling effect of her smile, the way her eyes deepened to purple in the sun. "I like this girl," he found himself thinking. "Really like her." Suzanne had stopped just then, turning on the narrow path to face Todd, her eyes afire with intensity. Todd's breath caught in his throat. She was only a few inches away from him. If he so much as moved forward, touched her mouth with his. Suzanne cleared her throat, and the moment was over. "How's Liz?" she asked gently. "I've thought about her so much. Is she bearing up okay with you all the way out here?" Todd heard himself begin to talk about Elizabeth, how busy she was, how much he missed her. But he couldn't forget the way his heartbeat had quickened a minute before under the fir trees. Had Suzanne felt it too? Was that why she'd brought Elizabeth up? For some reason, Todd felt unsteady as they walked back to the lodge. He could still remember it, the smell of the fir trees, the brilliant blue-black sheen of Suzanne's hair against the glistening white backdrop of snow, and the look in her eyes. Had she felt something too, or was he going crazy? Now, sitting in the snug, warm kitchen, Todd felt incredibly confused. Why hadn't he just told Liz the truth? After all, nothing had happened, he reminded himself. By keeping it quiet, he was turning it into a bigger deal than it really was. But if he said anything now, she'd wonder why he hadn't mentioned it right away. He decided it was best to stay quiet about it. And when he had a chance, he'd tell Suzanne to stay quiet about it too. Because Todd didn't want to hurt Elizabeth, not for anything in the world. They'd looked forward to this reunion for months, and he wanted it to go perfectly, just the way they'd dreamed. Even though, he reminded himself, Suzanne was going to be there too. It was beginning to look as if nothing was as simple as it had seemed a little while ago. In fact, Todd thought, it was beginning to look as if things might be getting pretty complicated that Christmas, and he had just helped to make things 10 times more complicated than before. "How can you possibly sleep?" Jessica demanded, sitting cross-legged on the carpet in Elizabeth's room, filing her nails with an emery board. Do you realize how much we've got to get done before Christmas? It's crazy enough around here without having to work overtime making life miserable for Suzanne. Suzanne, Elizabeth pointed out, crawling into bed, has been asleep for hours. Doesn't that mean we get to rest too? Jessica frowned at her sister, gesturing wildly with the emery board. Look, she said, don't you realize tonight is the eve of one of the most important days of your life? Todd is coming tomorrow, Liz. How can you possibly just conk out? Elizabeth moaned. With the lamp still on and all that noise you're making, I guess I can't, she mumbled, her face deep in the pillow. I can't sleep either, Jessica said, but that's because I've had nothing but chronic aggravation for the past few days. Do you realize, she demanded, flinging the emery board across the room, missing Elizabeth's dresser by a yard, that Leila Fowler is at a spa right now? A spa. Jessica made it sound as though Leila was committing murder even as she spoke. You're kidding, Elizabeth said, interested despite herself. Where, or more to the point, should I say why? She's toning her thighs, Jessica said, aggrieved, for $300 a day. She's at some place called La Venue, where all the stars go when they've eaten too much over Thanksgiving and need to lose a quick 5 pounds. That's amazing, Elizabeth said, sitting straight up. $300 a day? Jessica nodded. She left today. Kara told me. She'll be having massages and ultraviolet treatments and everything. Is all this just to get ready for the parade on Saturday? Elizabeth asked. Jessica giggled. She's going to be livid when she has to get into that elf suit, she said. But that's what she deserves. I would have won the title, fair and square, and I only used 2 little tea bags. You could use the microwave oven, Elizabeth suggested, lying down again. I'm not sure it's the same thing as ultraviolet, but very funny, Jessica sniffed. I don't care about any dumb old spa, she muttered. I'm going to look a lot better than Leila does this Saturday. Just wait and see. Besides, she giggled, no one will be able to see her glowing skin under all that green paint. Leila should find out Suzanne's secret, Elizabeth said thoughtfully. She really is thinner. I wonder how she did it. Probably by being crafty, evil, and manipulative, Jessica retorted. That'll make you lose weight any day. Elizabeth was quiet. She didn't know what to think about Suzanne. She looked at her clock. It was after midnight, and she'd set the alarm for 8 so she'd have plenty of time to get ready before Todd got there. Rolling over, she pushed her face into the cool pillow, and within minutes she was sound asleep. Chapter 8. Even after Elizabeth had finished her shower, Jessica was still asleep, curled up in a ball on the mattress on the floor, looking more angelic than Elizabeth could remember in ages. Elizabeth chuckled as she towel-dried her hair in front of the mirror. Leave her, she told herself. Poor Suzanne deserves to have a problem-free breakfast. It was 9 o'clock by the time Elizabeth went downstairs, and both her parents had already left for work. Suzanne was the only one in the kitchen. She obviously hadn't heard Elizabeth coming. She was standing over the sink, drinking a glass of water, because she jumped when Elizabeth came into the room. Good morning, Elizabeth said. Did you sleep well? Suzanne spun around, her cheeks slightly flushed. Yes, thanks, she mumbled, slipping something into the pocket of her bathrobe. It looked like a bottle of pills, but Elizabeth couldn't tell for sure. Have you eaten? Elizabeth asked, opening the Wakefield's pantry and surveying the cupboard shelves. I've just had some coffee, actually, Suzanne admitted. I was about to get something to eat when you came in. Fine, Elizabeth said. I'll get us both something if you'd like. Great, Suzanne said warmly. That'll give us a chance to catch up a little, too. Elizabeth took a box of cereal out of the cupboard, wishing that the prospect of catching up with Suzanne was more appealing than it seemed. What was it that rankled so about Suzanne? Her voice, her manner. She was so friendly, but Elizabeth couldn't listen to her without remembering everything that had happened the last time she came. Suzanne seemed to be reading her thoughts. I'm glad we're alone, she said in a low voice. I've really been anxious to talk to you, Liz. Elizabeth poured some cereal into 2 bowls. Really? She asked suspiciously. Suzanne took a deep breath. Liz, she began. Strawberries? Elizabeth asked her, taking a carton out of the refrigerator. Suzanne nodded, looking as if she really hadn't heard the question. Look, I know this must be dreadful for you 3, having me come out here. Dreadful? Elizabeth's eyebrows shot up. Don't be silly, she said lightly. Honestly, Susie, we're happy you're here. Suzanne flushed deeply. Elizabeth's tone was very different from her words, and it was obvious she wasn't sincere. Please, Suzanne begged. Liz, I really want to talk to you. Don't shut me out. Elizabeth bit her lip. It was so hard, she thought. Anyone would think she was crazy not to trust Suzanne. She looked so earnest, and it looked as if she cared so much. But that was how it looked before, she remembered. She couldn't imagine why this time would be different. Let's eat, Elizabeth said. We can talk, too, Suzanne, if you really want to. I want to apologize to you, Suzanne persisted, taking a seat at the kitchen table. I know I was a perfect beast when I was out here before, Liz. I was terrible to you. Taking your necklace? It's nothing, Suzanne, Elizabeth interrupted. Don't give it a second thought. And what happened with Mr. Collins? Suzanne continued, ignoring the blaze of indignation in Elizabeth's eyes. I have a feeling that's the hardest of all to explain. Would you believe... I believe anything, Elizabeth said coolly. Would you like some milk for your cereal? Suzanne's lower lip trembled. Maybe it would be better if I didn't talk about what happened, she began again. But I feel, with you anyway, Liz, that I've got to say something. I was going through a rotten time with my parents then, and I guess I was just kind of... Rotten? Jessica demanded, padding across the kitchen floor and yawning. What are you 2 talking about? Nothing, Elizabeth said flatly. Nothing at all. She couldn't bear hearing Suzanne bring up Mr. Collins's name. When she thought of that horrible night, when she thought that he had almost lost his job. Suzanne probably didn't know what it meant to need to work, she thought furiously. Maybe she thought Mr. Collins just taught for his own amusement. If he'd lost his job, what would have happened to him? And to poor little Teddy? Mr. Collins may have forgiven Suzanne, but Elizabeth couldn't. No way. Suzanne, Jessica said sweetly, sinking down into the chair next to their guest, I have to ask you something because I'm going out of my mind with worry. Have you seen the cream-colored silk blouse that was hanging in the front of my closet? Suzanne bit her lip, looking past Jessica to Elizabeth. No, she answered. Why? Jessica pouted. Darn, I've looked everywhere. I bought it at Lizette's last week to wear to the dance of the Patmans this Friday night. It cost a fortune, but I thought it was worth it because it really looks good, especially if I can get some sun before then. But it just isn't there, and unless someone just walked off with it... I haven't seen it, Suzanne said quietly, taking a sip of orange juice. Elizabeth glared at her sister. It'll turn up, she said shortly. Things always do, Jessica sang out sweetly, giving Suzanne a knowing look. Jessica was really pushing it, Elizabeth thought. Tell me, Jessica continued, oozing fake curiosity as she turned her gaze on Suzanne. Aren't you absolutely bored to death here in Sweet Valley? It must seem like Dullsville after the wild life you lead in New York. Liz, did I ever tell you about all of Suzanne's fabulous friends? That one who... Elizabeth sighed. Jess, do you want some cereal? I'm going to go upstairs and dry my hair. I'll get it, Jessica said, bouncing out of her chair. It'll give Suzanne and me a chance to get to know each other. She beamed. You really hate me, don't you? Suzanne said in a low voice when Elizabeth had left the room. Is it because of Pete? I had no idea he'd do something like that, Jessica. When Mother told me, I was absolutely... I don't want to talk about Pete, Jessica said angrily. It's none of my business, Susie, but I really think your taste in guys is a little bizarre. Suzanne sighed. Jessica, it wasn't like that with Pete at first. I don't know why he pulled anything on you. He's obviously a complete jerk, and I'm sorry. He has trouble with his parents, she added thoughtfully, rubbing her forehead with her hand. I see, Jessica said shortly. Of course, she added. Way out here in the sticks, we don't see very much of that sort of thing. We find— Way out here in what sticks? Stephen grumbled, coming into the room and pretending to get Jessica in a wrestling hold. Jessica tried to pull away as she heard the front doorbell ring. Let me go, Jessica wailed. Stephen, you're killing me. Should I get the door? Suzanne asked, getting to her feet. I'll get it, Jessica snapped, disentangling herself and racing for the front door. Well, Stephen said, giving Suzanne the first truly welcoming smile she'd had that morning and grabbing an orange from the fruit bowl in the center of the table. Did you get a good night's sleep, or did those two vampires keep you— Daisies! Jessica shrieked, hurrying back into the kitchen with an armful of flowers. Can you believe it? My secret Santa sent me daisies. They're gorgeous, Suzanne said, her face lighting up at the sight of the blooms. Some secret Santa, Steve said. First a jewel box, now flowers. I know who it is, Jessica said dreamily, imagining the look on Han's face when he leaned forward to kiss her at midnight this Friday. Someone who really likes you, obviously, Suzanne said, smiling. But what's a secret Santa? Stephen explained the custom to Suzanne while Jessica got a vase from the cupboard and began arranging the flowers. What a sweet idea, Suzanne said enthusiastically. I'd like to have one of those myself. Jessica snipped the bottom off one of the daisy stems. You know, she said pointedly, staring straight at Suzanne as she spoke, it never fails to surprise me when I get flowers. They're so incredibly beautiful, and they smell so wonderful. I always forget, she snipped another stem, that some flowers have thorns. Do you know what I mean, Susie? Suzanne paled. Jessica, Elizabeth called from the top of the stairs. Could you come up here for a second? I need to talk to you. Excuse me, Jessica said sweetly, leaving the scissors and flower stems all over the counter as she hurried out of the room. Suzanne stared after her, her face draining of color. Coming back to Sweet Valley was proving to be a great deal harder than she had anticipated, but she had vowed to stay and fight, and she wasn't going to quit now, however tough the battle seemed. Todd just called, Elizabeth said, rummaging around desperately in her drawer for a sweater she'd planned to wear. He'll be over any minute. Hey, did you tell Suzanne Todd was going to be in town? Jessica asked suddenly. I forgot to, Elizabeth admitted. Why? Jessica shook her head. Just wondering. As long as Todd's had fair warning, I don't see why. Elizabeth shook her head. It isn't here. Jess, have you seen my light blue sweater? Jessica's eyes lit up. No, she answered, but I bet I know who has. Oh, come on, Jess, Elizabeth reproached her, spotting the sweater at the back of her drawer. Here it is. What do you think? She asked critically, holding it up and glancing in the mirror. Pretty good, Jessica admitted. Do you want to borrow my leather pants? Elizabeth laughed. Todd would think I've changed too much. I better stick to these khakis. How do you think it's going? Jessica wondered aloud. Do you think old devil-may-care Devlin is getting the idea? You're really making it pretty obvious, Elizabeth sighed. Isn't there some way to be cool without being icy? I'm just afraid Mom and Dad are really going to be furious if they hear us carrying on the way we were just now at breakfast. Jessica shrugged. All the more reason to lay it on thick while they're at work. I'm sort of hoping she'll get the idea soon enough to leave before Friday night, she confided. Before Friday night? Are you kidding? We've got weeks more of Miss Devlin's company to endure. She just got here. Liz, Jessica said reproachfully, why do you think we're going to so much trouble? We're trying to get her to leave early, remember? Jessica, Elizabeth said, surprised. You don't really think she'll— Give me a few more days, Jessica said calmly. She's already so tense, it's unbelievable. A few more days and she'll be begging her parents to let her fly straight to St. Moritz. And that'll leave us the rest of the vacation, Devlin free. We can have a wonderful time the minute she's gone. Elizabeth was thinking fast. What do you think Mom and Dad would do if she asked to leave early? Wouldn't they be suspicious? Jessica shook her head. Why should they be? They know how bizarre she is. Face it, Liz, it's the only way we'll be able to salvage the vacation. Suzanne's just too much of a pain. Well, I still think we could be a bit more subtle. I really don't want her to have a nervous breakdown or anything. Then you saw them too, Jessica remarked. Saw what? The pills, Jessica exploded. What else? She must have 137 kinds of them in that little makeup case she's keeping under the sink in the bathroom. I tried to read the labels, but I didn't have time. Besides, all those things sound alike. Elizabeth looked shocked. You don't think she's really... What, a pill popper? Jessica laughed. Come on, Liz. What else is she doing with half a medicine chest in her makeup bag? That might explain the fact that she's lost weight, too, she pointed out. Elizabeth nodded slowly. You've got a point. I thought I saw her with some pills this morning, but I wasn't sure. Jessica sighed. Trust me, what we have on our hands here is a hysterical, devious drug addict, and the sooner we get her out of here, the better. I think I'd better change really quickly, Elizabeth said suddenly. Maybe we shouldn't leave her downstairs by herself. Tell me more about what you have planned for this week, Suzanne said pleasantly to Stephen. While Elizabeth had been dressing, Suzanne had changed into a denim skirt and a red silk shirt, and Elizabeth couldn't help admiring her as she and Jessica came into the living room. Well, there's the Christmas dance this Friday night, Stephen volunteered. Jessica gave him a nasty look. Christmas dance? Suzanne's face lit up. Do you think I could come along? Well, I don't, Jessica began. Absolutely, Steve cut in, glaring at Jessica. I'd love the chance to see some of your friends again, Suzanne said, smiling warmly at Elizabeth. Like Erin Dallas, for example. I always felt terrible about... Her eyes clouded over and she shook her head slightly. Anyway, I think it sounds terrific. I can't wait. And there's the big parade on Saturday, Stephen went on. Jessica, he said, chuckling, is going to be an elf. Isn't that right, Jess? Jessica, his sister fumed, tight-lipped, is going to be Miss Christmas Time. Leila Fowler is going to be an elf. Suzanne gasped. Miss Christmas Time? That's wonderful. Did you win a contest? Jessica turned on Suzanne, her eyes darkening. No, she seethed. I spent the whole day wearing a garbage bag, as a matter of fact. Suzanne looked horrified. But the doorbell rang but was muffled by Jessica's reaction. Never mind, Jessica screamed. Susie, it's none of your business. Tears welled in Suzanne's lovely eyes. I was only... Quiet, Elizabeth yelled, covering her ears. Wasn't that the doorbell? She demanded, getting out of her seat. I'm coming with you, Jessica muttered, practically knocking her sister down in her haste to get out of the living room. Come on, Suzanne, the twins heard Stephen say loudly. Let's go in the kitchen and finish arranging Jessica's flowers. Todd, Elizabeth exclaimed as she opened the door. She laughed as he engulfed her in a big bear hug. It felt great to see him again, Elizabeth thought. He looked terrific in his tan chino pants and green sweater. The same old Todd, back at last. Jessica was jumping up and down and hugging Todd, too. In fact, for several minutes, the three of them were a complete confusion of affectionate greetings and moist eyes. God, does it ever feel good to be back here, Todd exclaimed, grabbing Elizabeth's hand and squeezing it tightly. The next minute, the twins heard a gasp from the hallway. Suzanne had come out of the kitchen, carrying the glass vase filled with daisies, but she stood frozen in the hallway, staring past the twins as if she were literally unable to move. She was staring at Todd. Hey, it looks like I'm not the only out-of-towner around here, Todd said, trying to ease the tension. Suzanne was still staring at him, her eyes clouding over and her arms trembling violently. And the next thing anyone knew, the crystal vase had dropped from her hands onto the floor in the front hall and broken into dozens of pieces. Water and daisies were everywhere, and Suzanne, trembling all over, burst into tears and rushed out of the hallway.